Good morning. It's great to see so many of you joining us again this morning. We've opened the virtual doors on today's webinar and people are flooding in. I can see the numbers just going up really fast. So we're just going to give everyone a couple more moments to get in, get settled, potentially grab a cuppa, and we'll be kicking off in just 2 minutes time. Thank you. Okay, good morning. A very warm welcome to you all. I can see that there are many returning in today's webinar who were here with us in part one, so you're very welcome. It's great to have you back. And there's a lot of new faces with us today joining for the first time. My name is Caroline Preston. I am the Business Development Manager in PKF FPM, and I will be your host for this morning on part two of InterTrade Ireland's COVID-19 webinar series. We have another great panel lined up for you all, and today's topic is cash flow management and funding in Ireland. But before I hand over to Shane O'Hanlon from InterTrade Ireland to formally open the event and introduce our speakers and our panelists, first I will quickly do my Zoom host introduction and highlight a few points that everyone should be aware of. Today's session is being recorded in order to make it both accessible to you and to others on InterTrade Ireland's website following the event. So please do keep this in mind when you're asking any questions of a confidential nature. Our Q&A session this morning will take place at the end of our presentation. So if you do have any questions for our experts, please go and submit these in the Q&A box just at the very bottom of your screen at any stage throughout the presentation, just as and when the questions come to you. Then when we come to the Q&A session, I will enable your mic and call upon you to ask your questions directly to our panel. So the final thing to say is that we can't see you and we can't hear you, but we will be able to when we individually unmute you in the Q&A. So hopefully that will provide some clarity on today and help with a really interactive session again. So without further ado, I am going to hand over the floor to Shane and welcome him on screen. Hi Shane, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Good morning. Thank you, Caroline. Good morning, everyone. So on behalf of InterTrade Ireland, I'd like to welcome you onto what is the third in a series of 6 of what are proving very popular webinars designed to help businesses navigate their way through the key supports that have been put in place in both jurisdictions in response to COVID-19. Following on from last week's webinars, where we focused on the financial supports that have been put in place, this morning's session will look at cash flow management and funding. Fergal will cover business continuity planning, core funding principles, cash flow management, and how to approach a bank or other funder for support. But before we get started, I'd like to take the opportunity to bring to your attention some of the supports InterTrade Ireland have recently put in place to assist businesses during these uncertain times. I'm conscious quite a few of you were on our webinars last week, so I'll not labour these, but I think it's important just that I bring them to your attention. So firstly, eMERGE. eMERGE offers up to €2,800 fully funded consultancy support and advice to help your business develop online sales and e-commerce solutions. Very important, obviously, given people are changing how business is done. Secondly, Emergency Business Solutions. This offers up to €2,250 fully funded consultancy support and advice to address key business challenges, including cash flow, HR, and supply chain. Now, there are eligibility criteria for these programs. They're both the same, these supports, in that the company needs to be a manufacturing or tradable services business registered on the island, has a satisfactory trading history, is engaged in cross-border trade, us being the cross-border body, need to have the capacity to deliver the project over the next number of weeks, and is an SME, in that has 250 employees or less than 250 employees and an annual turnover less than 40 million. Additionally, InterTrade Ireland have produced 2 excellent resource documents that are very much complementary to this morning's session and this entire series of webinars. One is specific to Northern Ireland and the other Ireland. These are available on our website and they summarise the key information you and your business needs to know. Hopefully they'll be even more meaningful to you following this morning's webinar. And finally, alongside TAC Ireland, InterTrade Ireland have helped create an online platform in the form of an interactive map. This allows businesses to see who they can work with to combat the many supply chain and manufacturing challenges generated by the pandemic. All of these supports and much more can be found on our website, intertradeireland.com, and I'd encourage you to take a look at our website when you get a chance. So before I hand you over to Fergal, I'd like to say a few thank yous. Firstly, to June Butler, Head of SME Banking, Bank of Ireland, and to John Madigan of the Strategic Banking Corporation of Ireland. Thank you both for giving up your time to be with us this morning. It's genuinely greatly appreciated. And also to Fergal and his team at PKF FPM, most notably Michelle and Caroline, for putting these webinars together. So that's enough from me. I hope you enjoy this morning. Please try and get as much out of it as possible and ask our assembled experts as many questions as you can. So with that, I'll hand you straight over to Fergal. Thanks, Fergal.
Thank you very much, Shane. Much appreciated. And as I'm trying to get my slides pulled up, I'll just say first of all that Shane has said, I'm Fergal McCormick. I'm the Managing Director of PKF FPM, and we have 5 offices across the island of Ireland. And we're delighted, indeed honoured, to be asked by InterTrade Ireland to join them in presenting their webinar series to help businesses navigate through the COVID-19 crisis. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by my colleagues Michael Farr and Patrick McKenna for the Q&A session. And may I say that we were very encouraged by the very positive feedback from last week's webinar one for Irish businesses on COVID-19 financial supports for businesses operating in Ireland. And really building on that, webinar 2 today will focus on cash flow management and funding for ROI businesses. And in that context, we'll provide some context, and then we'll address the different types of funding, different types of, if I can get my slides working here, which are just not working at present, but hopefully they will shortly. I keep talking for a second, but my slides are not moving at present. But we talk, after we set the context, we will then move on to different types of funding and more importantly, the structure of bank debt. And finally, we'll then look at cash flow management and preparing a bank proposal incorporating a cash flow forecast. And in that context, obviously, we're very fortunate and delighted to be joined by John Madigan from the Strategic Banking Corporation of Ireland, and June Butler, who's the head of SME Banking at Bank of Ireland. And I have no doubt both John and June will be very helpful during the question and answer session in answering your queries. So without further ado, if we acknowledge that the Irish government, as it plots out a course for the reopening of the economy, and hopefully we'll hear positive news this morning in terms of their stepwise approach, business continuity and cash flow plans for Irish businesses across a range of activities and business sizes will come more into focus. And a huge effort will be required, I think, by everyone to boost consumer confidence as citizens remain uncomfortable, if we're being honest, from a health perspective of returning to the norm. And for businesses, most of whom have, experienced a cessation or significant reduction in revenue, there is no blueprint or roadmap forward because of the unique issues being caused by the corona pandemic. So there's no unique roadmap going forward as they contemplate the recommencement of trading. And despite this, it's very encouraging that many businesses have started to prepare for the recovery post-coronavirus. And in this context, 53% confirmed in our poll last week that they had already started to undertake business continuity planning. And that's very encouraging. Now, I think we have to acknowledge that a business can't just open its doors and start again. It will need a business continuity plan. And one of the things today, although we're focusing more on the bank proposal, it's fair to say that to make an effective bank proposal, if you haven't been thinking of your business continuity plan as an entirety, your bank proposal will not be a success. And it's also important to appreciate that liquidity will be the key to reopening for businesses. And research reaffirms that planning for and implementation of an appropriate level of liquidity will be crucial in defining the success of businesses' recovery in other post-economic crises. And that will be the case again in terms of the post-pandemic in Ireland and indeed the island of Ireland. Now, naturally anticipating future market conditions and customers' behaviours and attitudes will be pivotal to success, as will be labour resource management, the availability of it, and then the management of that talent. We all recognise that a new business landscape is evolving with expected changes in market and consumer behaviour and attitudes. And we'll all have to learn how to do things different ways. And as a result, we must focus our attention on re-engineering our business and looking at our whole business model going forward. Now, as I said, this week's webinar will focus primarily on business continuity planning, core funding principles, cash flow management, and preparing a bank proposal, etc. And as we've already acknowledged that the business can't just open the doors and start again, they'll have to plan the restart and reflect on the changing circumstances, such as the social distancing requirements we're reading in our papers in terms of in the short to medium term. But above all, the business must make sure that it has enough cash to pay the wages at the end of the week, or the month if that's the case, enough to pay the suppliers at the end of the month, and hopefully something left over for the owners to live on themselves. Now, it's also recognised that a crisis is a good time for us all to take a holistic view and look at our businesses. And I suggest that businesses should review their products and services, perhaps adjust their prices, and indeed their product and service lines and delivery channels. But across all of this, if the business does not have strong financial planning and liquidity at this key moment, it will be destined to fail. And I suppose one of the most important things to acknowledge always in situations like this is never to panic, because our present circumstances don't determine where we go. They merely determine where we start. And, you know, in terms of planning, it has to be acknowledged, if we don't have a destination, we won't get there. If you and I didn't decide to be in this webinar this morning, we wouldn't be here. It's the same with business. If you don't have a destination, you'll never get there. And remember, failing to plan is planning to fail. And if you think about it, and perhaps we accountants dread put too much attention to this at times, we can analyse the past, but more importantly, we must design the future. And design means putting things together to deliver a value-added solution to meet or exceed your customers or your clients' expectations, and thus deliver market differentiation and a competitive edge for your business. Now, I'm a great follower of the great basketball coach John Wooden, and I think basically he made a key point when he highlighted that the success is found in the running of the race, when he said, it's how you run the race, your planning, preparation, practice, and performance that counts for everything. Winning or losing is a byproduct, an after effect of that effort. For me, it's the quality of effort that counts most and offers the greatest and most lasting satisfaction. And if you think about it, what he also highlighted was he never once said in a dressing room, and I think I could be wrong, but I think I'm right in saying Jim Gavin, the Dublin manager, has also said this, they never once say go out and win. They say go out and deliver a performance. So for all of us today and going forward, the message is never cease trying to be the best we can become. Because success is a peace of mind, which is a direct result of self-satisfaction in knowing you made the effort to become the very best we are capable of. Now, I don't plan to go into too much business strategy today, but it is important because it sets the business continuity plan, it sets, more importantly, the bank proposal, and it also sets, when you go to look at what nature of funding you're looking for, where you should be. So in terms of developing a business strategy, and obviously some of us have had a little time in recent weeks, you look at your current position, your baseline. You then carry out a SWOT analysis and strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's important to appreciate, some people misunderstand SWOT analysis. Strengths and weaknesses are internal to your control. Opportunities and threats are external to your control. And none of us can operate our businesses in a bubble. We have to look at the periphery, what's influencing and affecting our businesses. And a very useful tool to help you look at opportunities and threats is it's a business tool called PESTLE. When I was at university, unfortunately, too many years ago to remember, it used to be called PEST, but it's now PESTLE. And that means looking at political, economic, social, technological, and the two they've added on is environmental and legal issues and how they may affect your business and the environment your business is operating in. And from that, you generate ideas. And obviously, you want your team doing this. Then you evaluate those ideas. And eventually, you start to develop your plan and milestone, but don't leave it on the shelf. The more important thing is to make sure you manage it, monitor, and make sure it's agile so you can amend. So certainly within our own business and for clients, we have basically adopted a strategic holistic tool called the PKF FPM Rocket. And in very simple terms, what it says is that the strategic plan determines the vision. And then the business plan actually takes the vision and it revisits it the best way to achieve it. Now, believe it or not, it doesn't have to be a big document. You can do this in 2 hours in the back of a very large envelope. But once you have the vision, you've got to decide your strategy and your structure. The most important thing is your culture, the glue, the DNA that links everything together. What is the DNA of your business? And more importantly, what do you desire to be in the future? And then, again, we believe, and think this over, you can see 20 divisions, 5 divisions, depending on the size of the business, but we think ultimately, there's 5 core operational areas in any business. There's the products and the services of the business. There's a marketing and sales plan. There's the underlying systems and processes. And there's the finance, physical, and resources. And finally, the most important, the people. And basically, if you have plans for those 5 operational areas, then you're starting to make progress. So what we're really saying here is that planning is needed for funding and the cash the business requires, when it is required, and where it will come from. Very important. And we're going to really focus on those few points shortly. And all of this must be underpinned by risk assessment. And that's a buzzword you're going to hear more and more in terms of business going forward. Have you carried out a risk assessment? Have you carried out a risk assessment, for example, for social distancing? Going back, important. Forensic and sensitivity analysis. Managing expected receipts and payments inclusive of any estimated error. We have to be realistic. None of us can forecast tomorrow with certainty. If we could, we'd all be billionaires. So you have to build in scenario planning. So basically, the strategy for the commercial revenue will vary significantly depending on, obviously, the activity sector, the size of the business, and the product or service that the business produces. However, there are many aspects of the financial planning in these unprecedented circumstances that all businesses will need to consider. And that's what we're trying to focus on at generic level today. Now, the first thing to understand in terms of funding, don't say I need funding, I'm away to the bank. That really is not smart, or I'm away to my family. You've got to first of all identify, in terms of funding, what is the cause of the funding requirement? Because the cause of the funding requirement will influence what is the appropriate form of funding to fund that requirement. So you've got to identify, is the funding requirement to fund cash losses? Is it to fund working capital? Is it to fund capital investment, R&D, or international trade? And then it's fair to say, and today is a high-level presentation, but it's trying to be holistic and inclusive. We've identified in the course of the presentation really the core source of funds for most businesses. And cash flow within the business, it can be supported by seeking an extension of credit period from creditors, or indeed negotiating reductions on outstanding debts. Believe it or not, as some of us will have found in recent weeks, it can also be achieved by the refinancing of existing unencumbered assets or to be honest with you, selling off assets you don't need, surplus assets. In terms of bank debt, the most common forms of bank debt are overdraft, loans, invoice, discounting, asset finance, etc. Now, really, to be fair to the Irish government, it introduced some very positive COVID-19 loan supports. We covered these in great detail last week, so we'll not cover them in the same detail this week, but we will cover them because you can't cover the subject matter without referring to them. Obviously, there's promoters' own equity, which is in the case of a company, ordinary shares or preference shares or quasi loans. In the case of a sole trader or a partnership, it's the sole trader or partnership loan funds. There's working capital finance, there's grants and financial incentives. There's trade finance, both domestic and international. And there's loan funds, which we'll come back and talk about. And there's some other alternative source of funds, which we'll talk about briefly, the venture capital and development funds, business angels. And finally, we'll touch briefly on, because it's becoming more common in some areas, the peer-to-peer loans and the crowdfunding. So it is important when looking at types of funds, always look at the other side of the table as well. And to be fair, it's important to balance the risk reward, because those who take the greatest risk get the greatest reward. That's the equity, that's you, because you're not guaranteed a return. You only get a return if the business makes profits and secondly can afford to pay you cash. Whereas take, for example, the bank debt, the bank, they get a low return and therefore they don't take high risks, but in return, they have to get paid. It's a commitment. You must pay the bank. And in between, you have grants and repayables. Now, it's important to appreciate that we've already identified the core areas of bank funding. And we touch on those and what they each do. The first, working capital in particular, in terms of cash flow management, we talk about quite considerably there. Asset financing is where you finance an asset over its expected economic life. That could be plant and machinery, it could be cars, etc. And the further bank finance we talked about there is growth long-term loans or specialist funding. Now, in terms of COVID-19, last week we highlighted this slide here, and we said to you that in terms of COVID-19, the crisis and the caused by the health crisis and the impact on the economy and business, that the first place to start from was looking at this slide and looking at basically, did your business qualify for assistance under the Strategic Banking Corporation of Ireland's core programs, Ireland and the government's core programs to help businesses secure debt finance in this period. And as I said, obviously we're joined by John Madigan, and John will be able to go into this in great detail. But in very simple terms, we highlighted last week that there were two core schemes. And the first thing you need to establish is, does your business meet the eligible criteria for these? There's a working capital scheme and there's a future growth loan scheme. And if you don't meet those, then you go back into the normal banking stream. And then there are three further potential loan assisted programs backed by SBCI, which are the credit guarantee scheme, which we'll talk about briefly, the Enterprise Ireland Sustaining Enterprise Fund, and then for small businesses, the MICROFINANCE COVID-19 business loans. We're going to cover these very briefly because we did go into them in detail last week. In terms of the working capital scheme, it's important to appreciate, and this is a very good scheme, that there really are two key criteria. One is that you must demonstrate that you've spent a minimum of 10% of your operating costs in one of the last 3 years on R&D, and going forward you're going to spend 80% of the loan on R&D and the adoption of in terms of the adoption of the business to mitigate COVID-19. Now, these loans basically are for working capital. They're for companies less than 250 with a turnover of less than 50 million. And the loans basically are between 25 and 1.5 million. And the key is they're 80% guaranteed by the bank, very attractive interest rates there you can see, and unsecured up to the first 500,000. Now, the three pillar banks, and that's why it's great to have June with us today from Bank of Ireland. The three pillar banks are delivering this scheme with support from the SBCI. And again, we're finding it very attractive, but the key point is that definition of innovation. And we covered it last week in terms of practical ways in which examples of which basically you could provide proof that going forward you're going to be spending the loan innovation. For example, service and a training business which closed, it requires working capital in order to continue to pay wages to some staff, meet the bills, etc. Now, the innovation there could be the reorganization of staff working processes to avoid infection would be eligible. Similarly, for example, a service manufacturer reorganizing employees into teams to limit the contamination effect of 1 or 2 people becoming infected, which is limiting efficiency and output, giving rise to increased working capital needs. This could be part of the social distancing, for example. Again, the reorganization of staff work processes to avoid infection would perhaps deem you eligible. And John will go into this and clarify this in more detail, as will June. Retail, again, increased working capital requirements, for example, for shops to adapt to increased demand, including increased staff costs due to the longer hours or the payments to staff unable to work due to be fair, again, the whole COVID-19 situation. And the innovation could be trying to adapt your shop layout to meet those requirements and to allow you to operate. And you can go on and on. I'm not going to go into the others because I went into them last week, but suffice to say that the slides will be available after the presentation, and you'll see they're good examples of what could perhaps be deemed eligible as innovation under the working capital scheme, which is very attractive. The future growth loan scheme is obviously for longer term investment for machine equipment, R&D, really business expansion. These loans are basically for 8 to 10 years. Again, the eligible companies are those less than 250 people, employing less and have a turnover less than 50 million euro on a balance sheet less than 43 million. And very attractive again, you can see basically 80% guarantee provided by SBCI, which is very attractive, and the interest rates again are good. So if you can qualify for either of these 2 schemes, that's where you would start. In terms of projects, perhaps from a banking point of view, are seen as high risk profile and weren't able to qualify initially for the long-term growth of the working capital, then there's a possibility in terms of the working capital that your bank, this would be the Bank of Ireland, for example, the AIB or Ulster Bank, they may well consider that your risk profile is due mainly to a lack of collateral or security, and they may nominate you or suggest you to the SBCI, the Banking Corporation of Ireland, Strategic Bank, as possibly suitable for the credit guarantee scheme. And if this is the case, then this is great because you can get a loan up to 7 years, 80% guaranteed. And again, these loans vary between 10,000 to 1 million euros. And finally, just to secondly, one on off this, the Sustaining Enterprise Fund, which is for Enterprise Ireland companies, as we highlighted last week, this is really a tripartite funding solution whereby companies which are finding it difficult to get funding under the original 2 core funding working capital and long-term growth schemes supported by SBCI, they basically go to Enterprise Ireland, and they can prove to Enterprise Ireland that they have engaged in conversations with SBCI and also relevant financial institutions. Enterprise Ireland will look perhaps at helping them with an Enterprise Ireland company, and there'll be a tripartite funding arrangement between the promoters of the business, Enterprise Ireland, and the related financial institution. However, it has to be stressed that Enterprise Ireland looks at the funding need in each case on a case-by-case basis. And finally, we covered last week, you remember in some detail also, for small businesses, the Microfinance Ireland loans for those businesses who couldn't get finance from their bank initially, who go to their local LEO and try and secure loans under the Microfinance Ireland scheme, which is also backed by SBCI. And again, these loans basically are between 5,000 to 50,000 loans. Businesses to be eligible must have less than 10 employees and a revenue, you can see there, less than 2 million. Again, this would now be to help businesses do, for example, a business plan, an application form for COVID-19 grant, cash flow forecast, business continuity plans, etc., etc. Very good scheme and particularly helpful for small businesses. Again, after the webinar, the detail on the slides will be available on the InterTradeIreland website. So in terms of grant assistance, again, you have quite a range. You have obviously COVID-19 grants and the unsecured loan assistance we just talked about. You have high potential startup funding, employment grants, training, R&D, innovation supports, and IT marketing and capital investment, all available before from Enterprise Ireland. You then have obviously research and development grants available, and then you have a range of supports which are available under various government bodies such as Board Bia, British Gamara, Chakas, and Fáilte Ireland. The local enterprise offices for smaller businesses, Forest and Gaelic, the LEADER programme via the Department of Rural and Community Development, and Shane has already referred to the COVID-19 assistance, which is available on InterTrade Ireland, and indeed the whole suite of InterTrade Ireland programs which are targeted at encouraging businesses to do cross-border business on the island of Ireland. So if we move on into venture capital, and the reason why this is important, remember, we go back to the original slide where we said you have to first of all understand what's causing your funding requirement, and then you've got to match it with the appropriate source of funds. So venture capital, it provides a long-term monetary investments in exchange for equity in a business. It's a form of risk capital, so it expects big rewards because it doesn't guarantee this return. And unlike banks, as I say, not guaranteed return. The majority of venture capital firms target business requiring over 500,000 euros, and mainly for expansion stage companies or managing buyouts or managing buy-ins. On the other hand, business angels tend to invest between 50,000 euros and 250 in startup and other early stage financing. Now, in our experience, business angel networks feature highly successful and self-made entrepreneurs who look to acquire shares in potentially lucrative early stage companies to use their own funds in. Now, it's also important to draw to your attention, very important actually, the Government Employment and Investment Incentive Scheme, commonly known as EII, because that provides tax relief to private investors to invest in SMEs as an added incentive for those investors. Obviously, in terms of venture capital, you have the Enterprise Ireland Support Venture Capital Scheme and Development. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but they're very attractive, and I'm sure many of you are currently utilising them. There's currently 700 million euros under management in the SBCI funds and support venture capital funds, and these typically invest across a range of industries. In typical investment range that I've previously highlighted from about 500,000 to 5 million, and again you have a number of funds available. In terms of the development capital scheme, it's aimed mainly at mid-sized companies and is aimed at export driven, because that's key, that it has to be generating revenue from off the island coming back into Ireland, and the funds there can range from 2 million to 10 million, and again those funds now can be a mix of debt, equity, or both, and sometimes quasi loans as well. So very interesting, and again I've identified there are 3 core providers of those schemes. Now, just before we conclude on the types of funding, coming into the market in recent years, there's been 2 particular types of new funding. One is called peer-to-peer loans, and they're really lending platforms. For example, some of you may be familiar with Grid Finance and Linked Finance, and they arrange loans from groups of individuals or organizations to entrepreneurs looking to grow. It's a way for a business to get funding without having to visit a bank, and lenders can use the platform, like a marketplace where they choose who they want to lend money to. Now, crowdfunding, on the other hand, it's basically their portals which offer a wealth of lending opportunities for startup and entrepreneurs, and they can pitch, they can make a pitch, the entrepreneur can make a pitch on a crowdfunding website for a sizable investment in their business model, with the ability for multiple investors then to invest small amounts towards achieving the entrepreneur's final total. Now, unlike traditional forms of business finance, crowdfunding is not directly repaid, and sometimes startups may instead opt to offer their investors some form of service in return for their financial support, such as a free sample of their product, etc. And just finally, in terms of source of finance, one final one I draw to your attention. If you remember, 2 weeks ago, the Irish government announced a 6.5 billion new support package for businesses, helping them to commence the recovery post-COVID-19. And one of these was targeted particularly at large organisations called the Irish Strategic Investment Fund Pandemic Stabilisation and Recovery Fund. It's operated by the NTMA, and there's £2 billion of capital in this fund. Again, targeted at very large companies employing more than 250 people with an excess of 50 million in turnover. And the investment can be in a range of instruments, including debt, equity, and other hybrid solutions. So what we're reading here is this diagram hopefully summarizes. In terms of equity funds, in terms of the business angels, you're talking between 50,000 and 500,000 euros. In terms of support venture capital funds, you're talking between 500,000 euros and 5 million euros. In terms of development capital funds, you're talking between 2 million euros and 10 million euros. On the other hand, if we look at the micro funds, if we look at the loan funds, the small micro businesses between 2,000 and 50,000 euros in MICROFINANCE Limited. Then you have the SBCI and the Enterprise Ireland ones ranging between 25 and 3 million euros. And finally, you have the, as I've just referred to there, ASIF from 3 million and upwards. Now, in our experience, the key criteria that the funding providers are looking for is they want to understand the level of funding required and for what purpose, which was the point I was trying to highlight earlier on. They want to ascertain and take a judgment on your ability to repay the borrowings if applicable. They want to try and get a feeling, is the business case realistic? Is there growth potential for the business? I mean, the one sure thing is a bank or a funder of any sort does not want to fund a business to continue to make losses. There has to be at some stage a demonstration that the business will start making profits in cash profits at that. And ultimately, they're going to look at you. Very importantly, you, whoever the project promoter is or the promoting team, the management, their ability to deliver the project. Now, in terms of assessing finance, it's really important that you appreciate the basic concepts of bank debt or indeed funding principles. And they are, you should borrow for long-term needs with long-term debt. You borrow for short-term needs with short-term debt. You should never fund long-term investment or capital investment by short-term working capital finance, such as bank overdrafts. It's a disaster waiting to happen. And all of a sudden, you can't then fund working capital, turn operations growth. You go to the bank and you say, I spent that on an asset. It's a lot more difficult then to get asset finance, and you find you're not getting anywhere near the amount of asset finance you'd have got at the time you were buying the asset. So really what we're saying is you match the term of the loan and the lease of the finance agreement over the expected economic life of the asset. And although it's a difficult economic climate at present for us all, but for banks, we have to say that with the support of the COVID-19 assistance from the government and the SBCI, to be fair, we're finding that banks are funding businesses so long as you can demonstrate it's a viable project post-COVID-19. So why is cash flow essential? And now obviously now we're moving into the whole area of cash flow management. Well, the reason is basically it was highlighted again by COVID-19, which caused a significant disruption to cash flow, declining current and indeed future sales, issues with debtor collection, reduction in suppliers' credit, increasing costs for certain materials due to supply issues, increasing costs going forward and certainly at present for those businesses that are fortunate enough to be open to facilitate social distancing requirements. Foreign exchange rates volatility, delays in receiving grants and support, although to be honest, we think that the various government agencies have been good in terms of practically getting as much, trying to help as quick as possible. The impact on supplier credit terms and ultimately inventory or stock holding, all affected. Now, if you think about it, cash flow management helps to navigate the way forward, particularly over the next 6 to 12 months. It helps to ensure that the business is protected and able to recover quickly post the pandemic. It ensures that you only borrow what you require and are able to service. Two big questions: what you require and the fact you hope that you can demonstrate you're able to service it. It helps you honor commitments to suppliers and employees and assists in the planning and the right combination of various government bank lending and supports to avail of. And it's certainly, as I've highlighted a few times, it's useful to do different scenario plannings. Now, in order to understand cash flow forecasting, it's important briefly for a second if we appreciate that everyone is not an accountant or lucky, and it is appreciated you get a broad understanding of what are the different financial statements. And it's true to say there are three core financial statements that you hear people regularly talk about: the profit and loss account, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement. Now, in terms of the balance sheet, very simply, it's a statement at a point in time, as at the 31st of December, or the 31st of March, or the 30th of April. At that very day, it summarizes or it estimates what your assets and liabilities are and your net asset or liability position. But if I got €1 million for every time someone said to me, "Are you sure I made a profit?" when I said, "Maybe you have a tax bill," I said, "No, how can I have a tax bill? I have less money now than I had at the start of the year." Now, the reason for that is that cash is not profit. And it's important to appreciate the difference. Profit is the difference between the total amount your business earns and all of its costs. It's usually assessed over a year, but it could be over a month, over a week, whatever. And cash, on the other hand, is the amount you have in your pocket today, in your business today, to pay your debts. Now, you can be showing a good profit on the books, and unfortunately it has been the case on many occasions, and still be strapped for cash to cover immediate debt. And indeed, some very profitable businesses have gone bust. So it's very important that you understand both. And working capital is a key requirement in our working capital management in terms of getting your cash flow right. Now, I just want to highlight this point. I use two very simple companies, Company A and Company B. They both have the exact same sales, 100,000. Sorry, I'm using simplistic figures here. They both have the exact same sales, 100,000, exact same cost of sales, 80,000, exact same profit for a year, 20,000. And believe it or not, they both have the exact same net assets of 20,000 at the end of the year. But let's look at them more carefully. Company A, if you look at what they've done, by the way, no cash sales here, all sales are credit sales. Company A, basically, they basically have been paid for £40,000 from debtors out of the 100,000 sales they've done, and they're still owed £60,000 receivables from debtors. And in terms of creditors, of their £80,000 cost of sales, they paid 30 and they still owe 50,000 to their suppliers. And the reality here is that they have bank of 10,000 in the bank, 10,000 euros in the bank. Company B, on the other hand, they have only been paid 20,000 pounds by their debtors, so there's still 80,000 euros still outstanding from their debtors. And in respect of creditors, they were very decent to their suppliers. They've paid actually 50,000 of the 80,000 they owe, and that means they still owe 30,000 to suppliers. Now let's have a look at the bank position. These two businesses, remember, exactly the same turnover, exactly the same profit, and exactly the same net assets. But look at the massive difference in their cash flow position. Company A has 10,000 euros in the bank, and Company B has an overdraft of 30,000. I hope that highlights to you the importance and the difference between profit and cash, and the importance of working capital management, which we're going to focus on shortly. So, to put it bluntly, cash is the lifeblood of any business. Quality internal management information and cash flow forecasts are essential. And that's why you notice bankers and other funders at present are seeking up-to-date management information of you. Because if you don't have it, you can't really run your business well. You should really try and move from focusing, if you think about it, on what credit the banks will provide the business to generating cash within your business. The less dependent you can be on a bank, albeit you may be now in the short term, but ultimately the less dependent you are on a bank or any funder, the better. Robust, we in our own organization, we call it robust, rigorous and regular reporting, the 4 R's. Really important in cash flow. Daily bank reconciliations where appropriate, but certainly weekly and monthly forecasts and bank reconciliations. Self-discipline and good management, I promise you, will yield positive results in our experience by improving profitability, but more importantly, reducing your risks through good cash flow management. Now, if you think about it, working capital and cash flow management, really, it is only 3 issues. There's 3 areas absorb cash. One is debtors, your receivables, if it's taking too long to get paid, to get the money in. The other is obviously creditors are the opposite, depending on the period, the time you take to pay your suppliers. And in between, you have a very important one called inventory, stock and work in progress, which can tie up a lot of cash. Very important to look at that area, really important. And it's as simple as that. And we're going to come into each of those 3 components. And you think about it, what is cash flow then? Well, cash flow is very simple. It's the cash on hand at the beginning of any period. It's the money you receive and spent during that ensuing period. And finally, it's then simply the euros or the cash remaining at the end of the period. It's not complicated, that's simple. And cash flow is simple, and it's very important we keep it simple. And cash flow management, to put it bluntly, is basically about speeding up the inflows of cash and slowing down the outflows. And the reality is that income and expenditure cash flows rarely coincide. But, and it's a big but, you must always be in a position to meet your scheduled payments. If you can't meet a payment, then you're not able to meet your liabilities, and unfortunately, you could have to go bust. So it's really important, you have to be able to meet your liabilities as the full due. This means that there can be times when you could simply not have enough ready cash to meet your commitments, and that's what you've got to avoid. Now, in terms of that, again, you think about it in the diagram form, because at times it's better to stand back, and we talked about, I think last week, working on the business rather than in it. And just for a second, let's pause. Because if you think about it, your cash flow reservoir, the money coming in, can only come from two sources. It can only come from the goods and services you sell, which is your receivables, or from basically shareholder input, borrowing, or grants. Basically, that's it. It can't come from any other source. And then in terms of outlet, where does your cash go? Well, it obviously goes on contributing to the direct costs of producing your service or product, your stock, your manufacturing. It goes on your overhead, your operating. It goes on, unfortunately, paying the tax man perhaps, buying capital expenditure, plant and equipment, paying interest finance costs, and also paying dividends or drawings to the business owners. It's as simple as that. 6 outlets, two core inflows. The source of cash flow for problems, they're quite common, and it's important we appreciate what they are. And they normally arise from a collapse in the economy, for example, in this occasion, the COVID-19 pandemic, insufficient funding, unplanned growth, poor credit control, international trading problems, which is slightly more complicated, is a different thing, and we're not covering it today, but it's a whole area, detailed area of a subject on its own, the whole area of foreign exchange management, etc. And under trading, which is probably what some people are experiencing at present because they're not able to trade at the capacity they'd like to. But equally, believe it or not, over trading. Whenever, in fact, you get ahead of yourselves, and whilst sales are great, the point is you haven't got sufficient cash coming in to fund the working capital funding gap. So improving cash flow is a very simple process of getting it right in terms of working capital management, and then looking at the cost, the trading pattern, the volume, and cash flow forecasting. And we're going to cover these briefly in the remainder of the webinar. So in terms of effective cash flow management and forecasting, there's a number of core steps. And step one, to be honest, is to establish the baseline position. What is your opening balance sheet? You do that by getting obviously make sure you have the bank statements and all your loan statements at that date. And again, your debtors and creditors listings at that date, at the baseline, the opening date of your projections. And to be fair, statements are even better because they're a third party confirming what they believe they owe you and equally what they believe you owe them. Step two, then, you give thought to outline your priorities for future trading. Your customer and supplier relationships, your business structures, your brand. Remember, brand's so important, all the things that make up brand and why people may be prepared to pay a premium for your product or service. And then the cash flow that links it all together. And finally, then, before you start, this is all at that early stage, you investigate, which hopefully we've helped you today, you investigate the support, you do research on the support available. What support could be available to help you? And discuss that with your accountants and your advisors and the LEO or Enterprise Ireland or indeed in the banks, etc. And then you start to get ready for the cash flow management. And you create a forecast with inflows and outflows for each interval period that you're deciding you're forecasting over. And your cash inflows, if you think about it, they include your operating, financing, investment, and revenue. And then on the other side, your outflows, the cost relating to all three. And then you also include all support available grants, etc. Now, if you remember, I said very early on time I was looking at the strategic plan, I said basically you have to then implement and monitor. And that's very important. You take the steps to obviously access the grant and loan schemes. You closely monitor the assumptions in your forecasts. You then compare your actual performance against forecasts. You look at the variances, could be very good reasons for it. The situation can be changed. You make sure your forecasts are agile, and you go back and constantly review them and amend them. Now, in reality, in terms of approaching the bank, a few tips we give you. In our observation, to be fair, banks are keen. They want to do business with their existing clients and build a trusted relationship and indeed develop their client base. But a sensible mix of debt and equity is important. Banks are not there to take equity risk for a banking return. It's back to that risk and reward diagram we discussed earlier. Banks want to see, and certainly in the COVID-19 environment, we believe banks that we've been dealing with, they do want to see the project promoters accepting some pain. Obviously, the commerciality and reasonability check of your proposal is very important. And does it look reasonable in the context of the current market environment, the competitors and returns, etc. Now, what we've done, we thought the best way to actually highlight a bank proposal is quickly to bring you through what we think is appropriate for a bank proposal. Obviously, this is not a business continuity plan, but the thought process that we covered earlier on in terms of the rocket will be very clear here. And this is a subset of this. This is your bank proposal element. So I'm not going to list them, but these are the, whatever it is, 11 different areas we think would be in a bank proposal. Very concise, by the way. Forget about depth, but each area needs to be addressed. So in terms of the executive summary, the key business highlights, you summarize the key strengths of the business and why under normal circumstances in terms of the COVID-19 environment, it is a good business to support. Now, you state the reasons for the funding requirement, you indicate the nature and the amount of the funding and the expected duration that you wish to fund. It's amazing. I regularly am asked to review banking proposals one way or the other, and it's amazing. I've read the first 3 pages and I can't find that out. You know, if it doesn't say that in the first page, there's a problem. If you don't say exactly those 3 things, and you're actually putting an application in for funding, you don't say those things. You say all these great things, all the things you're doing, focus on these 3 first of all. And obviously, if you wish to secure bank debt, I apologize that this slide was inadvertently put in. The wrong slide was put into today's presentation and tomorrow. But obviously, if you're thinking of hoping to secure finance from SBCI or from Enterprise Ireland, etc., and the various schemes, or the NEO we talked about, microfinance, you would say that here. And then, where possible, indicate the serviceability and the repayment, your ability to repay. Provide a table, I suggest, a very simple table of the current bank facilities and your proposed bank facilities. And provide obviously details of the security if appropriate. Now you've got to remember that in a number of the COVID-19 supports, particularly the loan supports, we highlighted there was a number of guarantees from the SBCI. So therefore, security may not be as important in this instance, but certainly if you're going above the limits, the 500,000, etc., you will need to provide evidence. Do you have a little bit of headroom in your current security and collateral? So in terms of the business overview section then, just a brief overview of the business operations, the market in which the business operates, where relevant, provide details of changes to be made as important to the management of the wider organization as a result of COVID-19 crisis, highlight the management expertise, their roles, responsibilities, and basically how they are going to impact, how, put it bluntly, it's not the how and the what in business, it's the why. Why people will come to your business and why you believe your management has the capability and the expertise to deliver the project you're talking about in terms of your bank proposal. And obviously any additional relevant background information you have would be helpful. In terms of Corona, naturally, you've got to actually identify what you think the key issues will be. And again, you know, go through them briefly, the impact on sales, the impact on costs, cost of sale purchases, supply chain, staff, etc. And just touch on those. Then, and obviously, in terms of the supports, don't be afraid to highlight any supports you have managed to secure to date, for example, in terms of the temporary wage subsidy scheme, etc., and the various other schemes that we've talked about this morning. Highlight those as well. And then obviously then describe the cash flow constraints and challenges that are arising from COVID-19. And again, very important, details of any actions you've been taking currently to address the COVID-19. For example, how you keep in contact with your customers if that's relevant, your suppliers, your staff, etc. And as we keep saying, please don't consider scenario planning different scenarios happening. In terms of the historic financial position, again, it's very simple, but you know, you really do need a wee checklist to check, have I included these? Because if you haven't, you're going to be asked them. And again, in our experience, your best chance with any funding provider is your first application. Your first. Get it right, pause, take your time, get it right. The worst thing I personally think you do is lift the phone and ring immediately. You're far better pausing, and you have a thought. Your outcome will be far better. So your most recent annual financial statements, your most recent management accounts, your most up-to-date debtors and creditors listings that we talked about, your current bank facilities, and a brief commentary on your historical performance and any unusual items in that to demonstrate historic profitability, debt serviceability, and the strength of the balance sheet. And then outline the business case going forward, because we all realize that COVID-19 is temporary. Thankfully, we wish it to be over as quick as possible, obviously. But we must plan to be in a position to have a potential sustainable business going forward to exploit that recovery when it comes. And from a business perspective, I would suggest to you that perhaps your plan needs to focus on the 3 R's. The reset, what are you resetting? What do you plan to refocus on? And more important, how do you plan to rebound faster after COVID-19? And remember, a good idea is to include opportunities that you've identified as a result of coronavirus. For example, I was talking to a hotel we have, a hotel restaurant client last night about 10:30, and they told me, I was talking about the US, what was happening in the US, and they said actually they're looking at New Zealand. They think New Zealand, the experience in New Zealand marketplace at present, is slightly ahead of the US. So always be looking around for opportunities, maybe from around the world, bring them back and see, can you apply it in your business? Also address potential change in customer profile. And if you think about, I just talked about here, I put down from a tourism point of view, but you do it from any sector. You have less international visitors expected in the short term, perhaps opportunities for staycations, because few of us will be leaving the island of Ireland. I never rarely leave it anyway, I host holiday in Ireland, but I'm just saying fewer will be leaving, so staycations will become more important. How can we make better use of our natural assets, leisure assets, and etc., daily life? And there is a belief, by the way, that perhaps there'll be more 24/7 thinking. People will be looking for longer 24/7 services and products, and obviously think of potential changes in food demand, healthy eating, better products to help the immune system, etc. So what do you think are going to give you unique differentiating factors in the market going ahead? Younger generation, I think it looks like they're less fearful of all the market research we're reading at present. And again, perhaps, is that a market you want to target more? Is that a market that may come back quicker than other age groups in terms of consumer spending? So, and obviously consider developing strategic alliances. You've seen that again in a number of, for example, you've seen for some cuisine dining are actually doing strategic alliances with taxi companies to deliver. I've also seen quite a few smart new strategic alliances arising between business and different sectors to complement each other to service the changing demands going forward. In terms of your financial projections, it's important that they're achievable and realistic. And again, what happens is you list these and you think them through back and forward. And, normally you have to get them to a period you think that the business will be back to trading at a profit, a reasonable profit. So it could be perhaps as long as 2 years, but certainly at least 12 months. And again, you look at your sales, you look at your cost of sales, you look at your labor requirements, you outline the key components under your working capital assumptions, etc. You go into VAT, your PRSI, POIE, etc. Social distancing costs, we talked about, you do need to highlight those, finance costs, proposed capital expenditure. And you state all those. And ultimately what happens is in the cash flow forecast, you'll come up with something like this here. And most likely you'll see if we say in April, coming into May now, obviously, you're seeing probably negative cash flow. The business is working at significantly below optimum, and it may not even be operating at all. And you can see that the drain on cash is continuing, and the business starts trading here. It started to trade, say, maybe in July, and it's starting then eventually income will exceed expenses, but not until, believe it or not, January 21 do they expect cash flow to become positive again. So that's the funding gap you'd be trying to fund in terms of your cash flow forecast. And again, for the purpose of the slides, you can see these on the website. We've taken that through and shown you an example. It's fair to say, in terms of doing your cash flow forecast, you do need to decide on the forecasting interval. Is it weekly or monthly? I would suggest monthly. You need to familiarize yourself with a forecasting tool, again, something like Microsoft Excel, etc. And that you got to link your calculations to your assumptions. Again, it's fair to say that you've got to cover every aspect of the business, but there's three core aspects. There's the operating aspect, which is your sales, your cost of sales, your wages, and your operating costs. Then there's the financing, which is your loan repayments and your interest commitments. And finally, there's the investing, the capital expenditure. And the one thing you got to be careful of, you may need to invest immediately in technology, etc., to have a future. So that has to be, if that's the case, you have to make a case for it. Now, we did say one of the important things is that then you carry out financial analysis, and don't be afraid to quickly look at test your forecast before you submit it in, and make points in terms of KPIs, in terms of sales trends, gross margins, what's happening in your business, you believe, relative to the sector, and how you're going to do reasonably well. And to do that, it's always good to put yourself in the shoes of the person on the other side of the table, and they will look at many key ratios. But here's four in particular to look at. They look at the times interest cover, which basically is the ability your forecasts are suggesting that you will have cash profits to pay your interest as it falls due. the PBIT. Then they'll look at your debt service capacity, which is basically your profit before interest and tax plus depreciation over your loan, which is the capital element, and your interest commitments during the first year. And then they look at your leverage percentage, which includes all your asset finance as well. And finally, they may well look at what they call their loan to value. And what that means is they look at your total debt facilities or your value of security. And that's where some of the schemes we highlighted earlier on may come in to help you. For example, the credit support scheme. So you carry out sensitivity analysis. It's very important you do this yourself and highlight it, because if you don't do it, the bank's going to do it anyway. And perhaps one of the things you might put in your sensitivity analysis, if business is delayed maybe for 2 months more than originally expected, or if it doesn't take off just as quick. And again, you can put in different factors that you think are most appropriate. Sales down 20% or up 10% or whatever. So that's the cash forecasting end. We'll move on briefly now to the elements of working capital that influence your cash management. And you try not to give credit, because if you can get paid up front, that's great. But if that's not the case, then you must have good credit control in your control systems. Debtor management is your management of the receivables, and there's a couple of very simple things you can do to hopefully reduce the average number of days it takes to get paid. You can agree terms of business at the outset. You can establish current credit practices, establish limits for each category of each company, each client. You can have credit limits and get perhaps then credit checks from credit agencies. You might even consider sales credit insurance. You may even visit the customer. I'm not going to go through each of these, but you can see obviously backs payments, credit cards, you people to pay you there and then. Reservation of title clauses, if it's applicable, is very good. It's where you actually put a clause into the terms of your business that says that if you're not paid for the goods, you can go and take them back again. They continue to be your ownership until you're paid for them. And unfortunately, you may have to consider issuing formal letters of request for payment and following, pursuing, and maybe even going down the road of pursuing legal remedies. Potential bad debt indicators that suggest you are business taking longer credit terms than would be the normal. The issue of post-dated check. If somebody starts issuing you post-dated checks, why are they doing that? They're doing that because they can't afford to pay you, potentially, at that time. It's a real warning sign. Keep your eye out for it. There's also a key point to watch is we're involved obviously in restructuring as well. And it's amazing whenever you, unfortunately, a business goes under and you go in to look at it, and you find quite often that a lot of the creditors that take them, the debtors that haven't paid them, they've done the exact same with a whole lot of other businesses. They keep switching around, they switch around petrol stations, or they switch around whatever it is, and they get a certain level of credit from all these different businesses, and they're not able to pay anything. So watch that. And new customers who's reluctant to give you a credit reference, that's a big warning sign. If somebody doesn't want to give you a credit reference, why not? And receiving round payments again is another way indicator to be careful of, because if somebody's giving you round payments rather than paying you for a specific invoice, that half hints that they're trying to keep the wolf away from the door. On the other hand, creditors management, which is basically how you control what you pay people, the first thing I'd suggest is if you don't have a handle on who is authorizing purchases, well, then look at that immediately. You shouldn't have too many people in your organization ultimately authorizing purchases, because once they authorize purchases, they commit you, and you'd be amazed the amount of things that are ordered you don't even know are being ordered. So get your purchasing system under control. Perhaps shop around for best value. It could well be you can stagger your supply. It could well be that that some suppliers are willing to supply on a return basis or consignment stock basis, which means that actually if you don't sell it, you'll take it back, and the supplier will take it back. We talked about inventory or stock management, also quite important, but again, you can put in place quite smart measures which will improve your stock management, physical control systems, know the number of times each year your stock turnover, what's your stock turnover ratio, very important. You want to turn over the quicker you can turn over, the better. It means you're not holding stocks, which can be very costly from a funding, but also security and space point of view. And definitely, in my view, consider selling off slow moving or outdated stock, because it only gets more difficult to sell in most cases with the passing of time. Again, you can benchmark your average stock levels against other firms in the sector. And one of the smart things that you're seeing an awful lot more people doing is to consider having part of your product or service outsourced, so you're passing that funding element onto another organization. Obviously, if you can implement a just-in-time process, that's the idea. Certainly if you're in the service business or certain manufacturing, but definitely work in progress management is the fundamental and most important. In our business, the key to our cash flow is how we manage work in progress. We try not to start a job with all the information we need to do the job and then complete it quick. The client's happy, but we're very happy because we get paid quick. So review your existing work in progress practices to identify any areas of improvement. Endeavor to minimize work in progress. I keep saying to my colleagues, work in progress not with a dime. You don't get paid for work in progress. You haven't raised an invoice for it. So the quicker you convert work in progress into a saleable product or service, the better. Focus on the contact. And if you're doing a long-term project, then try and put milestones in that you get paid as you go along, interim billing. Cost-cutting overheads, yes, surely at times I guess cost-cutting is very important, but it's important that we cut the costs from the fat and not from the muscle of the business. The cost-cutting is essential within a working capital strategy, but the worst thing you can do is say, I'm cutting 20% off everything. That's really lazy. That's actually very lazy. You maybe should be cutting 100% off something, or 40, and nothing off something else. You maybe should be investing more on something. So you have to look at the individual issues and keep overheads under constant review and have the courage, if you think about this, to be honest with you, to discontinue some costs. If they're no longer consistent with your new re-engineered goals of the business, then stop them. We talked briefly about international trade and currency management. You simply just can't allow it to evolve without doing something about it. And hedging techniques are available. And again, if anyone wants to talk about it, contact me offline after the seminar. We'll cover that. So a few practical tips. Before borrowing, I'd suggest the following. In short, encourage the payment of debtors if you can by offering people cash discounts. Negotiate additional credit from suppliers. Reduce your raw materials or finished goods level, that's your stock, try and get them down as low as possible. Seek additional support if you have to initially from the shareholders. Reduce, defer, or even consider cancelling tragically your own drawings and dividends. In my own business, my salary from the company is actually linked to the cash flow of the business. I can tell you it makes it very quick that you focus on cash flow. So if the cash isn't there, I get no salary. Defer capital expenditure in the short term and lease rather than, for example, buy equipment. Don't buy equipment from existing cash resources or by bank overdraft, and consider external equity funding. And if there is an inability, and this can happen to any of us in the short term, to honour commitments, again, I suggest the key is communication. Speak to your creditors, banks, the revenue commissioners, etc. To be honest with you, in our experience, if you speak to people in advance, I rarely have not seen a solution being found. Explore options for deferring or restructuring your debt. Involve business advisors. Regular communication with your creditors. We talked about reducing your drawings, defer capital expenditure, and a lot of it, early decision making. To be honest with you, if I could make one suggestion to you, maybe we can keep thinking we want to get perfect. I personally, as a rule, I get on with it. If I get it wrong, go back and correct it, because I think we can take too long thinking about it and not moving quick enough. So
Virgil, sorry, can I just to remind you of time? You asked me just to remind you. I'm just highlighting that. Thank you.
I know I'll be finished in 2 minutes, Caroline.
Thank you so much.
In terms of practical tips for surplus cash, again, hopefully if you have some, but there's a few tips here, and obviously ring fence it if you can, so that it doesn't get lost at a future stage. And I think what we're really trying to say here is inherent culture. The cash flow and working capital processes, they have to be inherent within your entire organization, and ensure that everyday conversations are talking about them, because they're key to your business. They're key to the survival of your business. And we believe that by talking about it regularly among the team, that obviously enhances the prospects of it being implemented. So virtually just to conclude, overarching principles to consider: cash is critical, but to be fair, saving the business is even more important. So get your priorities right, shield your core ideas, your business structures, your relationships, and your people. Be agile, adapt quickly to change and technological advances, and now take that decisive action, but above all, carrying leadership. So preparing pitches, I think we've covered this. I don't remember the do's. You obviously do a lot of planning, think it through, and discuss the various options before actually deciding what funding you want. And I think we've covered the don'ts subtly through the presentation. Don't overcommit the business. Ensure there is an ability to repay. Always be prepared if you're making an application for funding, and use short-term finance. Do not use short-term finance to fund long-term requirements. Bank debt, banks aren't there to take equity risks, we've said that, and basically being willing to invest in your banking relationship. So to conclude, I think I did in less than 2 minutes, Carly, actually. To be concluded, we did a pulse survey during the last InterTradeIreland webinar. We were quite surprised that it suggested that those taking part, 79% of the businesses had already access to COVID-19 bank support initiatives. Now, believe it or not, that compared to 24% in Northern Ireland. So it's a phenomenal complementary success rate to the banking sector. We're currently experiencing unprecedented uncertainty due to COVID-19, with an economic recession unfortunately forecast for both the island and the global economy. We're all currently attempting to weather the storm. But going forward, when the opportunity arises, the need will change to focusing on strategic positioning and delivering a sustainable business. I have no doubt that we will get over the original shockwaves and we will move forward. And hopefully today's webinar on approaching banks and other funders will help you in your future journey. So I'm delighted, Karen, to hand back to you now for questions.
Thank you, Fergal. Thank you. And apologies about that.
Oh no, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really so clear, and it really was in layman's terms, and so much that businesses can take away. There are a few questions coming in, actually quite a few, so I'm going to invite everyone to come on screen and come on camera while I wait for the panelists to join us. Let me again introduce you to who is joining Fergal on screen today. We have Michael Farrell, who heads up PKF-FPM's Irish branch, along with Patrick McKenna, and we have John Madigan, who's head of marketing and research from SBCI, and June Butler, head of SME banking in Bank of Ireland. So the first question actually comes in from Dennis. Dennis, I have enabled your mic. Do you want to come in and ask your question to the team? Go ahead, Dennis. Dennis, are you there? You just haven't pressed unmute. Okay, I'll read out Dennis's question.
I'm here now, yeah.
Oh, yes, great. Go ahead, Dennis.
Hi. Yes, we have a facility, and SBCI has been very helpful to us in the past. Thank you, John, your group. We have funding facilities, and we're involved with teledermatology, which is helping a lot of the GPs and the medical world speed up diagnostics for skin cancer and so on. The issue we have is where we have funding and would have had so for a year or two. We launched the company, of course, in January. We've obviously have to extend it, but we're currently using classically doing the wrong thing, spending our using cash reserves, about £2,000 this year, next year, the year after, on, in essence, the equipment which we give out free to the medical world. We need to finance that with leasing, and that's our difficulty at the moment. We could do it for a year, but it's putting us in a weak position, whereas our demand has increased because of the virtue of the problems we already have. But ideally, we're going to use up our cash by about March next year, unless we arrange leasing facilities. So that's my immediate interest.
John, obviously, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yeah, I mean, and June can jump in as well here. I mean, any of the banks will offer leasing facilities, and in a lot of cases, they'll lease existing assets that you've already purchased, providing that they have value and a good residual value. But if you're looking for specifically SBCI supported leasing solutions, then you're looking at, the likes of Fexco or SME Finance and Leasing, who would be our current leasing partners. But, and as I say, they will look at existing assets and they'll refi them over a period of time, just dependent on the value of the asset. And I'm sure June can contribute to that one as well.
Yeah, and Dennis, you've outlined there a challenge, I suppose, that we see many businesses facing. The actual level of debt across SMEs in Ireland is low, and it sounds like in the same position. So getting that mixture of debt on your balance sheet is a really good one to help you grow your business. We will absolutely look at, I suppose, medical equipment would be specialised equipment. And I think Fergal has given some really good tips there and things to consider. But essentially, we'll be looking at, I suppose, the cost and income that asset is going to generate, and then the cash flow that will generate to allow you to repay the loan or the leasing facility. So they're the kind of things that we would be considering. If it is specialised finance equipment, we may look for, I suppose, a higher upfront input from the business, just because of the specialised nature of the equipment. So I hope that's helpful.
Yes, I hope that answers your question, Dennis. The next person who's got a question is Ruth. Ruth, I have enabled your mic if you want to unmute and come and ask your question.
Hi,
Go ahead,
can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Yeah, I've been working on sourcing finance for a client of mine, and they were approved for SCBI support. And their principal bank is one of the pillar banks, and they've applied through that bank. And they've been told that their bank's SCBI allocation is already exhausted, and they're being nudged towards a standard loan facility that's unsupported. Could that possibly be correct?
Okay, I'll take that one, I suppose. Just, yeah, Ruth, this is probably in relation to the Future Growth Loan Scheme as opposed to the COVID-19 scheme. And the Future Growth Loan Scheme is, to a large extent, fully allocated. However, if your client is in, you know, a professional type occupation, there may be some leeway left with KBC Bank in order to pick up the loan through them. However, if they're looking for the COVID-19 scheme, the 3-year scheme, there's plenty of capacity available on that. We've had 2,000 people look for eligibility, 200 loans just in the last couple of days approved, and 35 million of the initial 200 million is utilized at this point. So there's plenty of capacity in the COVID-19 scheme and the Future Growth Loan Scheme. An additional 200 million has been announced by the Minister for Business in the last month, and that will be coming back into play. And that's the long-term scheme. That's the 8 to 10 year money, but that will take a couple of months to come back into the marketplace.
Yeah, Ruth, and to reiterate, Bank of Ireland has lots of availability under the COVID scheme. As John outlined, the Future Growth Loan Scheme was popular, and our allocation of that was completed. But just if you're advising your client, there will be a couple of other schemes from SBCI coming down the line as well that may suit their purposes. So just worth keeping an eye on those.
Thank you both. Next up, we have Damien. Damien, I have enabled your mic if you want to unmute and ask your question to our experts.
Hi. Yeah, just a quick one just on banks generally. I'm not sure if it's north or south, but if a bank is not sure about giving the funding and you require funding, what are your options?
Okay, well, maybe I'll just start on that one, Damien. I mean, if the bank is suggesting to you that you may not have sufficient, you know, adequate security, but as long as you can put the cash flow, then your options are to look for something that's supported by SBCI or government. And the schemes that you'd be looking at most likely will be the COVID-19 scheme if it's to do with changing your business for to react to or respond to the COVID challenge. If not, it's the current credit guarantee scheme, which is in play, which supports loans from 10,000 up to $1 million for a period of 7 years, actively being supported by Bank of Ireland at this minute in time, and again provides an 80% guarantee to the bank to support the lending. But it is specifically to support loans that don't have adequate security, but the bank would like to do the loan, but it's just that literally the cash flow is fine, but the security is not fully in place or not sufficient to actually make the bank comfortable around this. Can I just pick up one point on the COVID-19 as well? Just in the introduction by Fergal, there was a bit of conversation around the innovation criteria, and that's one that seems to cause a lot of SMEs problems around, you know, which number do I qualify under, or I'm not an R&D company, or I'm not a highly innovative company, I'm just a small retail company, I'm a shop, or I'm a small manufacturer, I employ 5 or 10 people. How do I actually, you know, how do I qualify under the innovation criterion? We're changing the wording on that for the next scheme, for the additional COVID scheme, to make it much simpler. But in the interim, what we're saying to people is that innovation criterion number 1, which is you spend 80% or more of the money on R&D or innovation. We have interpreted innovation to be any change to your business that will help you survive COVID-19. So what I'd say on this call is, if you are looking at the COVID-19 scheme and you believe you are not innovative, please tick box number 1 if you're making any change to your business to help you survive. and we will deem you eligible on that basis. So it's just an overriding note that I needed to get out there.
Thank you so much.
Damien, I might just add to that. If I'm reading your question correctly, the bank is telling you that you don't need the funding. I would say just get a little bit more detail on the reasons behind that and go back and look at your projections and your business plan again. I'm not sure if it's your own business or your client. And then if you still disagree with the outcome, there are a number of appeal processes available, either through the bank or through the credit review office. So just to be aware of those if you're unhappy with that decision.
Thank you, June. I hope that answers your question, Damien. We have David up next. David, I have enabled your mic. Please unmute and ask your question to the panel.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, questions for June. I have some clients that deal with Bank of Ireland. Just want to get an idea on some insights Bank of Ireland can provide in terms of support.
Yeah, thanks. So I suppose there's a couple of things I'll mention. We have been working very hard to make sure that we are supporting our customers during this time. We have a team of sector specialists that are hired from industry, and they're very close to those industries, and they're consistently feeding back to us, I suppose, the pressures that businesses in those sectors are facing. So we've tried to put some really practical things in place. So we've deferred current account fees, are offering payment breaks to customers who need them for 3 months. I know that's been extended to 6 months. We're offering emergency working capital if you need, emergency term lending or overdrafts, they're available. And I suppose we've worked really hard then to reorganize our business to make sure that our branches are available, our colleagues, our relationship managers are available. So there's some of the practical things that we've done, to support businesses. I would also say that, we have some of the best relationship managers in the country. They are very experienced. They have a really broad range of knowledge from dealing with a broad range of customers. So they're always a good point of contact if you're looking for in terms of funding for your business, or you need some advice as to things you should be considering. So there's some of the things, David, that we've put in place, but just to reiterate, I suppose, that we are available. We really are working hard to support our customers. So come and talk to us if you have a question or if there's a need that we can help you with.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for 2 more questions. We have a question in from Catherine, whose microphone isn't working. So what are the current bank processing times for approval of COVID-19 loan schemes? And are you finding any common issues that perhaps they could learn from? Put that to June first.
So our processing times are in around 48 hours for a decision from the time that we receive all the information. I suppose on the COVID scheme, while there have been a large number of eligibility certs are issued, as John has outlined, the number of applications coming in at the moment is still low enough. And there are probably a couple of reasons for that. I think some businesses are waiting to see what other supports might be available. Some businesses are working on their, their business plan, or I think John has given some really good tips there around, what to think about for innovation. So very, very quick turnarounds. We're not seeing any common issues coming through at the moment, Caroline. The applications that have come through us have been, businesses that were viable pre-COVID and will be viable post-COVID. Some very good business cases coming in.
Great. And our final question, Maria. Maria, would you like to ask the panel? I have enabled your mic. You unmute and go ahead. Maria? I'll just ask out her question then. She wants, if you wouldn't mind just repeating the advice on refinancing existing lease commitments, and if you could provide a bit more guidance on how organisations should approach this. Sure.
I suppose, obviously June is, from Bank of Ireland's viewpoint, they're very happy to do this. To look at the assets included, the names of the other companies are Fexco, Finance Ireland, and a new one called SME Finance and Leasing, which is a new one based on in the southeast of Ireland. But all of these, well, basically what you do is you approach them and say you have a bank of assets that you've bought. Let them assess the condition of the assets and let them assess the resale value of the asset. And then they will actually be in a position to make an offer and say, well, yes, we could actually lease those assets over a period of time for you based on the current value of the asset and based on the resale value of the asset. So it's really just a question of contacting those. All our lenders, including Bank of Ireland, all their contact details are on our site. Business banking details are on our site.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John, June, and the rest of the panel. Thank you for your time today, for your insights and your guidance and support. I'm sure the audience will agree with me, a very worthwhile session and great use of time. The recordings and the PowerPoint presentation will be up on the InterTradeIreland website. I have put the direct link in the chat, so you can grab it there and go straight to where you can get it from. Please don't forget that we are back tomorrow just for this same session for Northern Ireland businesses, and back next Friday and Thursday for part 3, which will be focused on planning for the recovery. All the details along with registration links, which are currently open, can be found on InterTradeIreland website. So all that's remaining for me to say is thank you everyone for your time, for joining us today, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.